Every torpedo fired meant another Japanese ship left the war forever. The thought pounded through my mind as I gripped the periscope handles, watching the enemy destroyer slice through the dark Pacific waters just 3,000 yards away. My name is Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, and I commanded the USS Tang during what would become one of the most devastating weeks in Japanese naval history. It was October 1944, and we were hunting in the Formosa Strait, a killing ground where American submarines would sink 30 enemy vessels in 7 days and shatter Japan's ability to supply their crumbling empire. The metallic ping of our sonar echoed through Tang's hull as we stalked our prey in the pre-dawn darkness. Each sound wave that bounced back painted a picture of death. Japanese merchant ships loaded with troops, fuel, and ammunition, all desperately needed to keep their war machine running. But they wouldn't reach their destination. Not on my watch. Not while Tang prowled these waters with 24 Mark 18 torpedoes ready to send the rising sun to the bottom of the Pacific. The moon hung like a silver coin over the Formosa Strait as we began our patrol on October 10, 1944. Tang cut through the black water at periscope depth, her diesel engine silent, running on battery power that would keep us submerged for hours. I had been commanding submarines for 3 years now, but this patrol felt different. Intelligence reports indicated massive Japanese convoy movements through these waters, supply lines that were the lifeblood of their Pacific defense. Sonar contact, bearing 090, range 8,000 yards, called out Sonarman First Class Floyd Caverly from his station. His voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the excitement underneath. We all knew what this meant. The Japanese were moving again. I pressed my eye to the periscope and slowly swept horizon. There, a black smudge against the star-filled sky. Then another, and another. My heart hammered against my ribs as I counted the silhouettes. 7 ships in convoy formation, steaming southwest toward the Philippines. Merchant vessels heavy with cargo, escorted by at least 2 destroyers. All stop, I ordered quietly. Take her down to 60 feet. The deck tilted slightly as Tang descended into the depths. In the control room, my crew moved with practiced efficiency. These men had been with me through 12 previous patrols. They knew the drill, knew the deadly dance we were about to perform. Plotting party lay below, I called out. Within moments, Executive Officer Frank Springer and Fire Control Chief Melvin Enos joined me at the attack center. The plotting board showed our position relative to the convoy, a geometry of death that would determine whether we lived or died in the next hour. Looks like a supply convoy bound for Leyte, Springer observed, studying the plot. Probably carrying reinforcements for the Philippines. I nodded grimly. General MacArthur's forces had landed on Leyte just days ago, and the Japanese were desperately trying to reinforce their garrison. Every ship we sank meant fewer enemy troops, less ammunition, less fuel to fight American boys on those bloody beaches. Maneuvering, make your depth 4 feet, I ordered. We're going to get ahead of them. For the next 2 hours, we played a deadly game of cat and mouse. Tang crept forward at 3 knots, positioning herself for the perfect attack. The convoy maintained its course, unaware that death stalked them beneath the waves. Through the periscope, I watched the lead destroyer sweep back and forth in front of the formation, its sonar pinging uselessly in the wrong direction. Range to lead merchant vessel, 4,000 yards, reported Torpedoman Chief William Leibold from the forward torpedo room. Torpedo tubes 1 through 4 ready in all respects, came the reply from the bow. I gripped the periscope handles tighter. This was it, the moment every submarine commander lived for. The chance to strike a blow that would echo across the Pacific, to send enemy steel to the bottom where it belonged. Bearing mark. Range mark. Bearing 270, range 3500 yards, called out the torpedo data computer operator. The setup was perfect. The convoy was steaming directly across our bow, presenting broadside targets that even a rookie couldn't miss. But these weren't practice shots. Each torpedo cost the American taxpayers $10,000, and more importantly, we only carried 24. Every shot had to count. Fire 1, I barked. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube, followed seconds later by 3 more. Each Mark 18 carried 575 pounds of Torpex explosive, enough to break the back of any merchant ship. I watched through the periscope as 4 white wakes streaked toward the convoy, each one carrying destruction and death. Time to target 2 minutes 40 seconds, reported the TDC operator. Those were the longest 2 minutes and 40 seconds of my life. In the control room, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the electric motors and the steady ping of the convoy's sonar, still searching in the wrong direction. Through the periscope, I watched the lead merchant vessel maintain its course, its crew completely unaware that 4 American torpedoes were racing toward their hull at 46 knots. Then the first explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun. The torpedo struck the lead ship just forward of the bridge, and I watched in grim satisfaction as orange flames erupted from her hull. The second torpedo hit amidships, breaking her back with a detonation that sent shock waves through the water. The third and fourth torpedoes both struck the second merchant vessel, and she began listing heavily to starboard. 2 hits on the lead ship, 2 hits on the second target, I announced to the crew. Both targets are sinking. A cheer went up from the control room, but I silenced it quickly. We weren't finished yet. The destroyers were already turning toward us, their crews frantically trying to locate the submarine that had just sent 2 of their charges to the bottom. Take her deep. Choose her feet, I ordered. Rig for depth charge attack. Tang dove toward the safety of the deep Pacific as the first destroyer reached our firing position. Through the hull, we could hear the high-pitched whine of her propellers as she searched for us. Then came the sound every submariner dreaded, the splash of depth charges hitting the water above us. The first explosion shook Tang like a toy in a giant's hand. Light bulbs shattered and equipment rattled against the bulkheads. The second explosion was closer, lifting the stern and slamming us back down into the water. But our hull held. Tang was built to take punishment, and she had proven herself in battle before. For 30 minutes, the destroyers hunted us, dropping depth charges in a methodical pattern. But the Pacific was vast, and finding a submarine in its depths was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Eventually, the explosions grew more distant, and I knew we had escaped. Sonar reports no contacts, called out Caverly. Take her up to periscope depth, I ordered. As Tang rose toward the surface, I pressed my eye to the periscope again. The convoy was gone, but the water was littered with debris and oil slicks. 2 Japanese ships lay on the bottom of the Formosa Strait, along with their cargo of troops and supplies. It was a good start, but we were just getting warmed up. Dawn broke gray and overcast on October 11th as we continued our patrol through the Formosa Strait. The previous night's attack had been just the beginning. Intelligence reports crackled over the radio all morning. Japanese convoys were moving through these waters in unprecedented numbers, desperately trying to reinforce their positions before American forces could cut them off completely. Contact report from Sealion, reported our radio operator. Large convoy, bearing north-northwest, estimated 15 vessels. I studied the chart in the control room. USS Sealion was patrolling about 30 miles north of our position, and if her report was accurate, we were looking at one of the largest Japanese convoy movements of the war. This was exactly what we had been waiting for. Set course 030, flank speed, I ordered. We're going to intercept. Tang surged forward, her powerful diesels driving us through the swells at 20 knots. The smell of diesel fuel and cigarette smoke filled the control room as we raced toward our next target. Through the open hatch, I could see my crew preparing for battle. In the forward torpedo room, Leibold and his men were already loading fresh torpedoes into the tubes. These were seasoned veterans who had been hunting Japanese shipping for months, and they knew their business. 3 hours later, we spotted smoke on the horizon. I climbed to the bridge and raised my binoculars, scanning the sea ahead. What I saw made my blood run cold, and my heart race with anticipation. It was the largest Japanese convoy I had ever seen. 12 merchant ships in 4 columns, escorted by at least 4 destroyers and 2 cruisers. They were steaming southeast, probably carrying reinforcements for the Philippines. "Clear the bridge! Dive! Dive!" I shouted down the hatch. The klaxon sounded throughout the boat as Tang dove beneath the waves. Within seconds, we were at periscope depth, and I was studying the convoy through the scope. These weren't just any merchant ships, they were large passenger vessels converted to troop transports. Each one could carry 3,000 soldiers, which meant we were looking at a potential 36,000 enemy troops heading for the Philippines. "This is it, boys," I announced over the 1MC. "The biggest target we've ever had. Every torpedo we fire is going to save American lives on those beaches." The crew responded with grim determination. These men understood what was at stake. Every Japanese soldier who didn't reach the Philippines was one less enemy firing at American Marines and GIs. Every ton of ammunition we sent to the bottom was ammunition that couldn't kill our boys. Maneuvering ahead 1/3. Make your depth 40 feet. For the next hour, we maneuvered into position for what would be the most important attack of our career. The convoy was steaming in a tight formation, the escorts weaving back and forth in front of the merchant ships. But they were following a predictable pattern, and I had been studying Japanese escort tactics for 3 years. "Range to lead transport, 5,000 yards, reported the TDC operator. "Bearing 240, angle on the bow starboard 45. The setup was perfect. The convoy was presenting us with overlapping targets. If we fired a full salvo, we could hit multiple ships with a single attack. But we had to be careful. Those destroyers looked alert, and their sonar was sweeping constantly. "Torpedo tubes 1 through 6 ready in all respects," called out Chief Leibold. I took one last look through the periscope. The lead transport was a massive vessel, probably a converted passenger liner. Her decks were crowded with what looked like troops and equipment. The second ship was smaller but equally packed with men and supplies. Behind them, the rest of the convoy stretched out like a chain of targets. "Fire 1. The first torpedo left its tube with a satisfying thud. "Fire 2. "Fire 3. "Fire 4. "Fire 5. "Fire 6. 6 torpedoes were now racing toward the convoy at 46 knots. Each one carried an explosive to sink a merchant ship, and I had aimed them at the 3 largest transports. Through the periscope, I watched the white wake streak toward their targets. Time to target, 3 minutes, 15 seconds. This time, the wait was even more excruciating. 6 torpedoes meant 6 chances to deal a devastating blow to the Japanese war effort. But it also meant 6 chances for mechanical failure, 6 chances for the enemy to spot the torpedo wakes and take evasive action. Then the first explosion erupted from the lead transport. The torpedo struck her just below the waterline, and I watched in amazement as the entire forward section of the ship disappeared in a ball-off flame. The second torpedo hit the same vessel amidships, and she began to list heavily to port. The third and fourth torpedoes both struck the second transport, and she began sinking immediately. But it was the fifth torpedo that provided the most spectacular result. It struck the third transport directly in what must have been her ammunition magazine, because the entire ship simply disintegrated in a massive explosion that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. "My God," whispered Executive Officer Springer. "Look at that." Through the periscope, I watched as 3 Japanese transports went to the bottom, taking with them thousands of enemy troops and tons of supplies. The convoy was in complete chaos, with the remaining ships scattering in all directions while the escorts converged on our position. "Take her deep. 250 feet, I ordered. "Rig for depth charge attack." The destroyers were on us within minutes, and this time they were angry. The depth charges came in salvos of 4 and 6, shaking Tang like a leaf in a hurricane. But we had dealt them a devastating blow, and they knew it. 3 of their largest transports were gone, along with their precious cargo of men and equipment. As we lay silent in the depths, listening to the destroyers hunt for us, I couldn't help but smile. In 2 attacks, we had sunk 5 Japanese ships and probably killed more enemy troops than an entire army division. This was what submarine warfare was all about, striking from the shadows, hitting hard, and disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. But we weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot. By October 13th, the entire American submarine fleet in the Formosa Strait had been mobilized for what Admiral Lockwood would later call the most successful coordinated submarine attack of the Pacific War. Tang was now operating as part of a wolf pack with USS Sealion and USS Salmon, and together we were systematically destroying every Japanese vessel that tried to transit these waters. The radio crackled with contact reports all morning. Sealion had sunk 2 more merchant ships during the night, while Salmon had torpedoed a Japanese cruiser. The enemy was being bled white, and they knew it. Intelligence intercepts indicated that the Japanese Navy was frantically trying to reorganize their convoy routes, but it was too late. We controlled these waters now. Sonar contact, bearing 045, range 12,000 yards, called out cavalry from his station. I pressed my eye to the periscope and swept the horizon. There, another convoy, this one smaller but moving fast. 4 merchant ships with a single destroyer escort, probably trying to make a high-speed run through the Strait under cover of darkness. Battle stations, I ordered. The crew responded instantly. After 4 days of continuous action, Tang had become a killing machine. Every man knew his job, and they performed it with deadly efficiency. In the torpedo room, fresh fish were loaded into the tubes. In the control room, the plotting party calculated firing solutions. In the engine room, the electricians stood ready to give us emergency power if needed. "Looks like a fast convoy," observed Springer, studying the plot. "Probably carrying high-priority cargo." I nodded. The Japanese were getting desperate now. Their regular convoy schedules had been completely disrupted by our attacks, and they were resorting to high-speed dashes with minimal escort. It was a sign of their desperation and our success. Maneuvering ahead 2/3. Make your depth 60 feet. We had been at this for days now, and the routine was becoming familiar. Stalk, maneuver, attack, escape. Each time, more Japanese ships went to the bottom. Each time, the enemy's ability to supply their forces was further degraded. We were winning this war 1 torpedo at a time. Rongetto-led merchant vessel, 6,000 yards, reported the TDC operator. Bearing 310, angle on the bow, port 30. The convoy was moving fast, probably making 15 knots. But they were following a straight course, which made them predictable. The single destroyer was weaving in front of the formation, but she was concentrating on the threat ahead, not below. Torpedo tubes 1 through 4 ready in all respects. I took one last look through the periscope. The lead ship was a large freighter, probably carrying fuel or ammunition. The second ship looked like a troop transport, her decks crowded with men and equipment. Both were legitimate military targets, and both were about to join their comrades on the bottom of the Pacific. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. 4 more torpedoes leaped from Tang's tubes, their deadly cargo racing toward the enemy at 46 knots. Through the periscope, I watched the white wakes streak across the dark water. In just over 2 minutes, 4 more Japanese ships would be burning. Time to target 2 minutes, 30 seconds. But this time, something went wrong. The lead ship's lookout spotted the torpedo wakes and began signaling frantically. The convoy scattered, with each ship turning hard to avoid the incoming torpedoes. The destroyer immediately turned toward us, her sonar pinging frantically as she searched for our position. 2 of our torpedoes missed their targets completely, but the third struck the second merchant ship amidships. She began sinking immediately, her crew abandoning ship in lifeboats. The 4th torpedo struck the 3rd ship in the stern, and she began listing heavily but remained afloat. 1 sunk, 1 damaged, I announced to the crew. "Take her deep to their feet." The destroyer was on us within minutes, and this time she knew exactly where we were. The first depth charge exploded directly overhead, lifting Tang's stern and slamming us back down into the water. The lights went out throughout the boat, and we switched to emergency power. "Damage report," I called out. "Minor flooding in the forward battery compartment," reported the damage control party. "We can handle it." More depth charges exploded around us, each one shaking the boat like a giant's fist. But Tang was built tough, and her crew was tougher. We had been through this before, and we would get through it again. After 20 minutes of punishment, the destroyer gave up and rejoined what was left of her convoy. We had sunk another Japanese ship and damaged a second, but more importantly, we had demonstrated that no enemy vessel was safe in these waters. The Japanese Navy was learning that Formosa Strait had become a killing ground for American submarines. "Take her up to periscope depth," I ordered. As Tang rose toward the surface, I pressed my eye to the periscope again. The convoy was gone, but the water was littered with debris and lifeboats. Another Japanese ship lay on the bottom, along with her cargo of men and supplies. We were systematically destroying the enemy's ability to wage war, one torpedo at a time. But the best was yet to come. October 24, 1944, would go down in history as the day the Japanese Navy suffered its most devastating losses to submarine attack. Intelligence reports had been pouring in all week about a massive Japanese fleet movement, the largest concentration of enemy warships since the Battle of the Philippine Sea. They were making one final, desperate attempt to break through to the Philippines and destroy MacArthur's invasion force. What they didn't know was that Tang and her sister submarines were waiting for them. Flash message from ComSubPac reported our radio operator. Large enemy task force approaching from the northwest. All submarines to intercept and attack. I studied the decoded message in the control room. The Japanese were coming in force, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. It was their entire remaining fleet, committed to one final battle. But they had to transit the Formosa Strait to reach the Philippines, and that meant running the gauntlet of American submarines. Set course 270, flank speed, I ordered. We're going to intercept. Tang surged forward through the swells, her diesels driving us toward our destiny. This was what we had trained for, what we had been building toward through dozens of patrols and hundreds of attacks. The chance to strike a blow that would cripple the Japanese Navy forever. 6 hours later, we spotted the enemy fleet on the horizon. I climbed to the bridge and raised my binoculars, scanning the sea ahead. What I saw took me breath away. It was the largest concentration of Japanese warships I had ever seen. 4 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 12 cruisers, and at least 30 destroyers. They were steaming in a massive formation that covered miles of ocean. Clear the bridge, dive, dive, I shouted down the hatch. Tang dove beneath the waves as the enemy fleet approached. At periscope depth, I watched the massive formation steam past our position. These were the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had conquered the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Now they were making their final desperate gambit to turn the tide of war. But they were about to learn that the tide had already turned. Sonar contacts all around us, reported Caverly. I count at least 40 ships. Looks like their entire fleet, observed Springer. This is our chance to end the war. I nodded grimly. Every ship we sank now would be one less ship threatening American forces in the Philippines. Every Japanese sailor who went to the bottom would be one less enemy fighting American boys on those bloody beaches. Maneuvering ahead 1/3. Make your depth 40 feet. For the next 2 hours, we maneuvered through the enemy formation, looking for the perfect target. The Japanese fleet was steaming in multiple columns, with the aircraft carriers in the center surrounded by battleships and cruisers. The destroyers weaved back and forth around the formation, their sonar sweeping constantly for submarines. Range to nearest carrier. 8,000 yards, reported the TDC operator. Bearing 290, angle on the bow starboard 60. The carrier was a massive vessel, probably the Shokaku or one of her sisters. Her flight deck was crowded with aircraft, and her escort was tight. But she was maintaining a steady course, and that made her vulnerable. Torpedo tubes 1 through 6 ready in all respects, called out Chief Leibold. I pressed my eye to theproscope one last time. The carrier was steaming directly across our bow, presenting the perfect broadside target. Her crew had no idea that death was stalking them from below. In just a few minutes, one of Japan's most powerful warships would be heading for the bottom of the Pacific. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. 6 torpedoes leaped from Tang's tubes, racing toward the enemy carrier at 46 knots. Each one carried 575 pounds of Torpex explosive, enough to break the back of even the largest warship. Through the periscope, I watched the white wakes streak toward their target. Time to target, 4 minutes, 20 seconds. Those were the longest 4 minutes of my life. Everything we had worked for, everything we had trained for, came down to this moment. 6 American torpedoes against one of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers. 6 chances to strike a blow that would echo across the Pacific. Then the first explosion erupted from the carrier's hull. The torpedo struck her just below the waterline, and I watched in amazement as orange flames erupted from her hangar deck. The second torpedo hit amidships, and she began listing to starboard. The third and fourth torpedoes both struck her stern, and she began sinking by the stern. But it was the fifth torpedo that provided the killing blow. It struck the carrier directly in her aviation fuel storage, and the entire ship disappeared in a massive explosion that sent aircraft and debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave from the explosion shattered windows on the surrounding escort vessels. "Carrier sunk," I announced over the 1MC. "Scratch one flat top." The crew erupted in cheers, but I silenced them quickly. The destroyers were already converging on our position, and we had to get deep fast. But we had just sunk one of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, along with her entire air group. It was a blow from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. "Take her deep, 300 feet," I ordered. "Rig fore-depth charge attack." The destroyers were on us within minutes, and this time they were furious. The depth charges came in continuous salvos, shaking Tang like a leaf in a hurricane. But we had dealt them a devastating blow, and they knew it. One of their most powerful warships was gone, along with her aircraft and crew. As we lay silent in the depths, listening to the destroyers hunt for us, I couldn't help but reflect on what we had accomplished. In 2 weeks of continuous operations, Tang and her sister submarines had sunk over 30 Japanese vessels, merchant ships, warships, and transports. We had destroyed hundreds of aircraft, killed thousands of enemy troops, and sent millions of tons of supplies to the bottom of the Pacific. The Japanese Navy was finished. They might still have ships, but they had lost their ability to project power across the Pacific. The war was effectively over, even if the dying would continue for several more months. The depth charges had stopped falling an hour ago, but Tang remained at 300 feet, waiting for the all-clear. The Japanese destroyers had finally given up their search and rejoined what was left of their fleet. Through the hull, we could hear the distant sound of their propellers fading into the darkness. "Sonar reports all clear," called out Caverly. "Take her up to periscope depth," I ordered. As Tang rose toward the surface, I pressed my eye to the periscope one last time. The enemy fleet was gone, but the water was littered with debris and oil slicks. The carrier we had sunk was nowhere to be seen, just a massive oil slick that stretched for miles across the Pacific. Somewhere beneath those dark waters lay one of Japan's most powerful warships, along with her crew of 3,000 men. "Surface the boat," I ordered. Tang broke through the waves into the cool night air. I climbed to the bridge and raised my binoculars, scanning the horizon. In the distance, I could see the glow of fires on the water, other Japanese ships that had fallen victim to American submarines. USS Sealion had sunk 2 destroyers, while USS Salmon had torpedoed a cruiser. The entire Japanese fleet was in retreat, leaving behind a trail of burning ships and dead sailors. Radio message from ComSubPac, reported our radio operator. "Mission accomplished. Return to base." I nodded and handed the message to Springer. Our part in the battle was over. In 2 weeks of operations, we had fired every torpedo we carried and sunk 7 enemy vessels. But more importantly, we had been part of something bigger, a coordinated submarine campaign that had crippled the Japanese Navy and ended their ability to threaten American forces in the Pacific. "Set course for Pearl Harbor," I ordered. "We're going home." As Tang turned eastward toward Hawaii, I remained on the bridge, watching the sun rise over the Pacific. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned decisively in America's favor. The Japanese Navy was finished, their merchant marine was destroyed, and their ability to supply their far-flung empire was broken. We had accomplished what no surface fleet could have done. We had strangled the Japanese war effort at its source. But victory had come at a price. In the forward torpedo room, Chief Leibold was counting our remaining fish. We had started the patrol with 24 torpedoes and fired every one. Each torpedo had cost the American taxpayers $10,000, but more importantly, Each one had represented months of work by thousands of Americans, the workers who built them, the sailors who loaded them, the officers who fired them. And we weren't the only ones who had paid a price. The Japanese sailors who went down with their ships were somebody's sons, somebody's husbands, somebody's fathers. They had fought bravely for their country, just as we had fought for ours. The fact that they were our enemies didn't make their deaths any less tragic. "Skipper," called out Springer from the hatch. Radio message from Admiral Lockwood. "He wants to congratulate us on a job well done." I nodded but didn't reply. A job well done. 7 enemy ships sunk, hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed, thousands of enemy troops killed. From a military standpoint, it had been a complete success. But from a human standpoint, it had been a tragedy of epic proportions. As Tang continued eastward toward Pearl Harbor, I thought about the men we had left behind in the depths of the Pacific. Japanese sailors who would never see their families again. American submariners who had died in similar attacks on our own ships. War was a terrible thing, but sometimes it was necessary. Sometimes good men had to die so that evil could be defeated. The Japanese had started this war with their sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. They had bombed our ships, killed our sailors, and forced us into a conflict we had never wanted. We had responded with overwhelming force, using our industrial might and technological superiority to bring the war to their doorstep. And now, after 3 years of bitter fighting, we were finally winning. But victory would not come without cost. Every ship we sank, every plane you shot down, every soldier we killed was purchased with American blood and treasure. The men of Tang had been lucky. We had completed our patrol without losing a single sailor. But other submarines had not been so fortunate. USS Harder, USS Robalo, USS Flyer, and dozens of other boats had been lost to enemy action, taking their crews with them to the bottom of the Pacific. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I could see the outline of Pearl Harbor on the horizon. Home, safety, hot food and fresh water, clean sheets and solid ground beneath our feet. But for the men we had left behind in the depths of the Pacific, there would be no homecoming. They would remain forever on patrol, standing watch over the ships and aircraft they had destroyed with their lives. That was the price of victory in the Pacific, not just the ships and planes and equipment, but the young men who had given their lives to preserve freedom and democracy. They had died so that America could live, so that the principles of liberty and justice could survive in a world threatened by fascism and tyranny. As Tang entered Pearl Harbor and tied up at the submarine base, I looked back at the crew that had served with me through 2 weeks of combat. They were tired, dirty, and exhausted, but they were also proud. They had done their duty, served their country, and helped win the war. They had been part of something bigger than themselves, something that would be remembered long after they were gone. The war would continue for several more months, but the decisive moment had passed. The Japanese Navy was finished, their merchant marine was destroyed, and their ability to supply their empire was broken. American submarines had accomplished what no surface fleet could have done. They had strangled the Japanese war effort at its source. But the real victory was not in the ships we had sunk or the planes we had destroyed. The real victory was in the principles we had defended: freedom, democracy, and the right of nations to determine their own destiny. These were the values that had motivated us to fight, the ideals that had sustained us through the darkest hours of the war. As I walked down the gangplank of Tang for the last time, I thought about the men who had served with me and the battles we had fought together. We had been part of something greater than ourselves, something that would echo through history long after we were gone. We had been the silent hunters of the Pacific, the underwater warriors who had brought the war to the enemy's doorstep. And in the end, that was enough. We had done our duty, served our country, and helped preserve the freedom that makes America great. The price had been high, but it had been worth paying. The Pacific was safe, the war was won, and democracy had triumphed over tyranny. That was the legacy of Tang and her crew, not just the ships we had sunk, but the principles we had defended and the freedom we had preserved for future generations. It was a legacy written in blood and sacrifice, but it was a legacy that would endure long after the last veteran of the Pacific War had passed away. The silent hunters had completed their mission. The war was over, and America had won.